newcomers. Yes, we are just going to record this session, and so if you don't want to be recorded, please hide your camera. So the book we are going to present today has recently been published by Amsterdam University Press, and it is edited by myself, by Dr. Ethemcan Turhan, and Professor Marco Armiero. Marco Armiero, as many of you know, is a professor, ICREA professor at the Institute of History of Science of the Autonomous University of Barcelona, and is also the editor-in-chief of Resistance, a journal of Radical Environmental Humanities that today sponsors also this book launch. Ethemcan Turhan is an assistant professor of environmental planning at the Department of Planning and Environment of the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, and he is the co-editor of the book Transforming Social Nature in Turkey. So this book brings together 16 authors in 12 chapters plus a foreword with very varied contributions and styles, and we inquire into the status of social and climate mobilizations in cities that are confronting multiple crises and top-down solutions to this crisis. Crisis linked to extreme weather events, environmental breakdown, social injustice, issues of losses and damages, and questions of adaptation. So I won't say much, just some notes about how this is going to play out. So we have a lot to cover, and the way it's gonna play out is first, Professor Marco Armiero will give us a short overview of the Occupy Climate Change project, that is the project that was the basis to develop this book. And also he will tell us how this all came about. Then Dr. Ethemcan Turhan will guide us through the features of the book, and together these two interventions will take approximately 10 minutes in total. And then we will give the floor to Professor Erik Swyngedouw, a dear friend and ally in many intellectual adventures, and Erik will provide us with his take on the issues discussed in the book and some reflections on it. And finally, last but not least, Dr. Panagiota Kotsila, author of one of the chapters of the book and also a dear friend, will intervene with a contribution based on her work and some more general ideas about the concerns of the book. And both Erik and Panagiota will have about 10 minutes. After that, we will open up the discussion to the audience and to the other authors present to welcome questions, reflections, comments, and you will also be able to use the chat option if you prefer to write your question or comment. And so, without further ado, I leave the floor to Professor Marco Armiero. Please, Marco.
Thank you very much, Salva. Could you please share the screen so we can, as we arranged, it would be easier for me. Thank you. And yes, I will also start my timer so I don't speak more than 5 minutes. So hi, a warm welcome also from me, and many thanks to Erik, Panagiota, and all the authors of the book, Formas, which funded the project, and all of you for being here today with us. I have 5 minutes to tell you about our project, Occupy Climate Change. So let's move quickly through my presentation. Next, please. Before entering into the Occupy project, just a few words about Resistance, a journal of Radical Environmental Humanities, which, as Salva said, is co-hosting this event since 2023, when I became the editor-in-chief of the journal. Resilience changed its title to mark the new intellectual and political agenda I wished to foster. All of us editors in this volume, Salva, Etam, and myself, are involved in the coordination of Resistance. So I would like to ask all of you to support this almost new journal and see it as a radical venue for your radical scholarship. So next, Occupy Climate Change was a 3-year project funded by the Swedish Agency Formas, aiming to explore how grassroots and municipal innovation are tackling climate change. We started from 5 cities, New York, Rio, Istanbul, Naples, and Malmo, and this was our team, as you can see in the slide. Next, theoretically, Occupy challenged 3 mainstream assumptions about climate change: the narrative of the future apocalypse, the scale of intervention, and the apolitical consensus. Next. In the global north, climate change is a comfortable prophecy about the future that might allow to impose an emergency regime that will deploy the expertise and technical apparatus to save us from the apocalypse. No? So this is the narrative. Occupy challenges this apocalyptic discourse, acknowledging that for indigenous communities, the apocalypse is in the past, not in the future. And we need to shift from a prophecy kind of discourse to a historical discourse. Next. The second narrative that Occupy challenges concern the scale of intervention. Climate change is the realm either of the state or of individual choices. The politics of climate change seem to be made either at COPs or at the supermarket. So we wish to recover both the power of collective action and the community experiences happening everywhere. Next slide, please. Erik Swyngedouw is here now with us. He argued several times that climate change has become the ultimate post-political discourse, a space of hyper-consensus where the only thing needed is to follow the guidance of the experts. But acknowledging human-induced climate change still leaves wide room for diverse antagonistic political options, as you can see from the slide. The next slide, Occupy has researched the collective initiative tackling climate change, mostly in the urban environment. The overarching question was how can society at large adopt, nurture, and learn from those grassroots and diffuse innovations. And here in the slide, you can read about our methodologies and so on. Occupy has also developed a creative offshoot of the project devoted to understanding how people, mostly university students, imagine the future of their cities. So both social and narrative experiments have merged into the Occupy Atlas of the Other Worlds. Next slide. Occupy major theoretical contribution has been the development of the category of urban climate insurgency. It is insurgent not in the sense that implies violence, but the radical rejection of the current socio-ecological system. Next slide. When the project ended in 2022, instead of closing up the project and moving to a next grant, we launched the Occupy Goes Global initiative, initiating the Occupy Graduate School that has so far involved almost 80 students and 30 teachers. In the next slide, you can see the main outcomes of the project. You see the special issue that we co-edited for social text, the book that Ashley Dawson has just published, this book just here, and a few books that were not precisely published by the project, but in which our people from our team has chapters in it. And there are also a few master dissertation and PhD dissertation. Now, yes, I am supposed to stop just a couple of minutes. If you go to the next slide, Salva, this is the main output of the project, the Atlas of the Other Worlds, which is an online open access database gathering grassroots and municipal initiatives tackling climate change, but also a collection of climate fiction stories written by youth from all over the world. And I am leaving here now with the next two slides, which are like a photograph album of a few things that we have done in the last few years. And thank you so much. Sorry, Adam, I am eating a little bit of your time.
Great. Well, thank you, Marco, for this great introduction. I'm going to keep it short because I think Marco gave a really comprehensive picture of what we have done over the 3 years and beyond in the Occupy Climate Change project. And it's actually a great honor and a big source of joy for me also seeing a lot of colleagues, comrades, and allies here in this call as well. I see lots of our project partners and beyond, people who actually contributed to the success of the project and the edited volume that emerged from it. So in just a few minutes, I would like to give you a sense of how this edited volume came to being. It actually started with this workshop that we have organized on 5th and 6th of March 2020. It may sound like any ordinary date, but as you will remember, that was only a few days before the whole world went on lockdown with COVID-19. So basically, the book we have in front of us today is a volume that was conceived and finalized between March 2020 to December 2022. So it had a long journey. And basically, in the meantime, we had a war in the eastern flanks of Europe. We had, right after the book was finalized, we had the genocidal assault on Gaza. And basically, this book comes in a moment which we believe is an important moment to think about cities, climate crisis, and particularly urban forms of climate justice, not as isolating different topics, but really bringing them together. The questions around social justice writ large within the climate crisis that basically travels all the way from racial justice, gender justice, and basically justice for the colonized countries, past and present. And basically, out of this workshop that we have organized on 5th and 6th of March in 2020, we managed to pull together quite a few of our contributors to the workshop, but we also commissioned chapters to fill some knowledge gaps that we have identified to our dear colleagues. So eventually, as Salvatore also mentioned at the beginning, we ended up with this book, which we are very proud about, that features 12 chapters and a foreword, a generous foreword by our colleague and friend, David Pello. And basically, one of the things that we really value about the book is that it's open access, because most of the time the knowledge that we produce in academia stays within the ivory tower. And we really think that this shouldn't be the case. And our scholarship, radical scholarship, really needs to touch the ground to check itself and have basically a reality check. And we really hope that this book would reach its audience beyond academia and really go back and forth between the activists that were the main protagonists of the book that we worked with here. So I'm going to stop here and hand it over to Salvatore. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks a lot, Ethemcan, and thanks to Marco for introducing our work to the audience. And I want now to briefly introduce Professor Erik Swyngedouw. So Erik Swyngedouw is a professor of geography at Manchester University in the UK. He's one of the proponents and one of the most prolific authors in the field of studies known as urban political ecology. And Erik is also the author and co-editor of important and influential books in the field, such as Liquid Power, In the Nature of Cities, and more recently, Urban Political Ecology in the Anthropo-Obscene. All great books. And so I'm giving the word to Erik. I remind you, you have around 10 minutes. The floor is yours, Erik.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Salvo. I hope everyone can hear me. I do not have a presentation, a formal presentation. I'm just going to talk around some of the key issues that struck me while I was reading the book, and hope that my comments would contribute to the conversation we will have later on. It's a fantastic book. So for those who have not yet downloaded and read the book, please do so as soon as possible after this meeting. And please do send the link of the book to all your colleagues, friends, and comrades around the world. I mean, it's freely accessible, which in itself is quite an achievement. And it is a fantastic book. I read it twice, actually, because I actually think I refereed it for Amsterdam University Press months and months ago. I remember that I liked it a lot then, so of course recommended this publication, and I started reading it again last week, and I thought, I've read this book before, and I couldn't remember exactly when. It's a beautifully written book, which more than deserves its place in the plethora of books that have been written on climate change politics, and climate change activism. It really stands out in the way in which it tries to deal with transformative socio-ecological movements in an urban context. There are not many books like that. Moreover, both its substance and its tone of argumentation excuse me, is very different from the mainstream social movement literature, of which there is arguably way too much now. As I said, it's a beautifully written book that is not only diagnostic in its conceptualization, but actually points at different ways of thinking and acting from within an urban environmental context. I'm not going to go through the book, as I just said, just download it and read it. I am going to give you just a few thoughts that came up while I was reading the book. And the kind of thoughts that I would like to briefly summarize here are thoughts that have been preoccupying my own work over the past few years or so. What do we have? And where are we going? And what do we, and by we I mean, of course, intellectuals, theorists, academics who are allied with the most radical socio-environmental movements. What do we think and do next on the basis of the insights that are so well summarized in this fantastic book? The first point is that the book testifies to the extraordinary wealth of socio-ecological climate-based movements around the world. Of course, the book can't detail all of them, but it does give a fantastic overview of nature of initiatives, the mode of thinking, the radical attempts to organize life in the environment and the city in different ways. It testifies to the courage, enthusiasm of thousands, if not hundreds, thousands of people who put their life often on the line in this project of trying to move towards a socially more just and ecologically more sensible urban environment. And as with so many other books, what it demonstrates is that the successes are rare and far apart, and that failures are much more common. And I have no answer to that. But how do we address the question or the issue of how such an extraordinarily potent in principle and certainly enthusiastic social urban movements, who may occasionally have important local successes, rarely if ever built up towards more systemic changes or transformation. This is of course a question that has been raised many times before, but I do think it takes a new urgency, in a context in which there is, on the one hand, so much concern and indeed sustained activism around the climate issue, yet if we look at the naked data on the dynamics of climate change, the situation is getting worse by the day. How can we grasp this contradiction between the enthusiasm, organizational capacities, insights generated by these social movements and their relative lack of success? That's one issue. The second issue, second theme I want to raise is about acting. What constitutes a political act in contrast to other types of acting? While reading this book, as well as reading about other environmental and ecological movements elsewhere, they all act. So acting is, of course, a key component and a key ingredient of any configuration that aims at socio-ecological change. Of course, not all acting is the same. There are a wide range of different forms of acting, and together with my colleague Lucas Paul, who is actually also here listening to us, we've been thinking quite a bit about what constitutes acting, and more particularly what constitutes political acting. And Lucas and I have been looking at psychoanalytic Lacanian perspectives in recent years in an attempt to cut through the intellectual deadlock and political deadlock that I and others think that we're in. And in much of the psychoanalytic literature, and some of the psychoanalytic literature, a distinction is made between what Jacques Lacan calls acting out and passage to the act. So on the one hand, you have acting out, and you're on the other hand, passage to the act. Both in the book, but also more widely, if we consider the climate movements, I suspect that what many are doing in terms of acting is a form of acting out. It's a kind of hysterical act that questions the existing configuration, but operates fully within the contours of the situation. And in its acting, very rarely succeeds in shifting the terrain by which one looks at the situation, the way in which one acts within the situation, and how one might shift the state of the situation slightly. So a key example of acting out is when climate activists are throwing soap or paint at a famous painting somewhere, a Van Gogh or whatever painting. It's a classic form of acting out. It does operate within the existing configuration. It takes its place within it, and doesn't change the coordinates of the existing configuration. Passage to the act, in contrast, is a form of acting that does not fit within the configuration. It is a form of acting that does not accept the hegemonic narrative, the master discourse as it is currently constituted. I sometimes find it difficult to think of examples, but in your book there's a fantastic example, I think, of passage to the act, which is the chapter on Chile. A chapter that carefully narrates how at least some of the movements operated within concerns and questions with climate change, environmental justice, etc. But in its universalization, in its scaling up, it became more and more concerned with political issues to such an extent that it managed to write a new constitution. A new constitution that will ultimately fail, of course, in the referendum. But as a political act, it was absolutely astounding, I thought. It was a great political success And it was such a success, I think, because it succeeded to get away from the master narrative that we often find in the climate argument, that ultimately what is at issue in a process of socio-ecological change is not the damn climate. If we want to take seriously that the climate matters, and you in your introduction make that perfectly clear, the activism has to move away from the strict climate terrain. The climate terrain, let's leave that to mainstream academics, environmental scientists, and COP meetings. I really think it's very important for politically effective action to shift the gaze from what is ultimately the symptom of the situation, that is climate change, to attacking its causes and its mechanisms. The third point, how much time do I have? Oh, I have to finish. The third point is that the book, as well as many others, narrate this extraordinary enthusiasm that we find among so many activists. But as I just said, it is not very effective in even slightly changing the history of the future. And what I think we're not very good at is to deal with the enemy. We of course all know who the enemy or enemies are. That's not too difficult. Gigantic number of books have been written on identifying the key embodied drivers of climate change. And what we do know from history is that when there is a danger for change, the enemy will mobilize whatever it takes in order to make sure that things do not really change. Whatever it takes, that is, any form of violence, from discursive to physical, will be mobilized, and in the past has been mobilized to make sure that their positions stay as they are. What I rarely encounter in analysis of socio-ecological climate movements is what kind of violence are we prepared to inflict on our enemy? How do we deal with or how should we deal with the inevitable violence that is already mobilized and that will intensify if social movements were to be more successful? And then finally, to conclude, there is this fantastic chapter in the book on hope by Vanessa. Wonderful book, wonderfully crafted chapter where she carefully circles around this notion of hope. Is there hope? Can there be hope? And what we often find in accounts of grassroots environmental movements is this sense of hope, that it is possible. It is not too late. Again, perhaps we may want to revisit that, as my colleague Lucas Paul and myself have argued and will continue to argue in our forthcoming book. What if it is too late? What if there is no hope any longer? Might it be possible to start thinking about courage in a situation in which all hope is gone, a situation in which the apocalypse, the catastrophe, is not a promise to come, but has already been a reality for many, many people? Not for us here on the whole, but for many people around the world. There is no hope. The catastrophe has already happened. What can we think, and how can we act, and what kind of courage can still be mobilized at a time that all hope is gone? I'll leave it with that. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Erik. Really Thank you so much for the appreciation and very sharp comments that will stay with us for some time. I now would like to very briefly introduce Dr. Panagiota Kotsila, our next speaker. She's a researcher at ICTA, the Autonomous University of Barcelona, and she has been a leading researcher in the Barcelona Lab for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability, and also a co-PI in the project on feminist political ecology, WIGO. And recently, she received a consolidator grant from the European Research Council to develop the project Embracing Immigrant Knowledge for Just Climate Health and Adaptation, of which we read also in this book. So thank you very much, Panagiota, for being with us, and I leave you the floor.
Thank you, Salvatore. I'm going to share my screen, so I share a few slides that I have here. Let me know if you can see it well.
Yes, it works.
Just a second. Can you see my slide or my notes? My slide? Okay.
No, or just the slide.
Okay, perfect. Very happy to have been part of this book project, along with a number of other edited collections this last 2 years. I think really mark a significant contribution and a need for these things to be more thought about and written on. The urban climate, justice, politics, urban political ecology. So thank you to the editors for putting together this collection. Thank you for inviting me to this launch event, and very happy to share this conversation also with Erik, who's been a huge inspiration throughout the years, along with the three of you. So my chapter in this book invites us to take an intersectional justice approach to urban adaptation. It calls for approaching climate change as an everyday lived reality experience, as something that today radically informs the already unequal ways in which life is organized in the city. So it's focusing on the ways in which certain phenomena that have to do with weather, with temperatures, with surrounding ecologies of vectors and disease are shaped and are reshaped by climate, in turn impacting health and well-being in ways that can be new, entirely new, or exacerbated or abrupt. So there's a lot of research on climate impacts on health in the last 10 years that's coming up, but not so much on how this is understood, experienced, and embodied differently by different groups and individuals, and what can this tell us in terms of climate justice. So here in this chapter, in this book, I propose that we should focus on these kinds of understandings and embodied experiences of climate-related health impacts in order to be able to speak in a more informed way about radical and justice-oriented conceptualizations of climate vulnerability and adaptation. Now, surely when we talk about adaptation or maladaptation, how we talk about these things depends on the position of the observer, right? So who is looking at what aspect of adaptation or maladaptation in order to define it as such really changes things. And I will come back to that issue of positionality and knowledge later on. Adaptation is not an innocent concept. Like Erik has also argued in other occasions, adaptation has become this shared phantasmic space, as he calls it, this commonsensical place that we all have to act upon and invest in and participate in one way or another, and which, of course, like any other abstract concept, like sustainability or resilience or nature, it can be captured, it can be distorted, it can be made to mean nothing or boiled down to mean what capital wants it to mean, and instrumentalized so as to continue doing business as usual, extracting value, exploiting people's labors without challenging the unequal distribution of power, resources, or systems of oppressive power relations. So why do we need to talk about adaptation and redefine it or radicalize it and not abandon it altogether? Concepts become what we make of them. They're always embedded in the realities in which we live. They can hardly escape this tendency of being captured or appropriated in neoliberal techno-managerial discourses. However, I think that concepts like adaptation or sustainability or environmentalism for that sake, also carry a huge potential to plurally mobilize action and transformative change. And Erik got me thinking here about what does action mean, and what is political action and what is not, but we can talk about that later. So surely adaptation is not an innocent concept. Like Andrea Nightingale also noted for resilience, it's not an innocent concept, but it is an excellent lens through which we can examine the politics of scale in climate change debates. So like her, I'm also interested in how knowledge that is embodied at the personal, individual or community or neighborhood level can be scaled to redefine adaptation towards more just horizons. And like other authors in this book have noted, have asked, how can we transform and decolonize the well-meaning and progressive climate policies of the Green New Deal, for example, so that they actually speak to the needs and desires of Global South and other marginalized communities, like David Pello writes in his foreword? Or how can we locate marginal voices at the center of climate adaptation, making visible the ways in which the urban periphery matters to those who inhabit it, and how their knowledge and experience as political agents can inform more hopeful trajectories towards uncertain climate future, like Karen Paiva Henrique also writes in this book. Now, in my chapter, I focus on migrants coming from countries of the Global South to Europe, residing in European cities. Why am I focusing on migrants? In the most recent report of the European Environmental Agency on the impacts of climate to human health in Europe, it says that low-income groups tend to be overrepresented in dense urban environments and in poor quality housing prone to overheating. So the European Environmental Agency highlights heat, vector-borne disease, and infection risk as the most kind of the strongest types of impacts that people might be facing in Europe in the next few years. And I continue, it says, people on the lowest incomes tend to work in manual jobs that are often performed in hot indoor environments or outside, exposing them to high temperatures or infection risk through contact with vectors. So these situations that the report describes fit exactly with what migrant residents from Global South countries tend to experience, because they belong to these groups of low income people working in outdoors environments, living in poor quality housing, etc. And we know from research globally that immigrant communities are affected by climate change because their countries of origin have been especially vulnerable to it and exposed to it and impacted by it. But also when they reach their destination countries and places of destination, they tend to live in underinvested neighborhoods, climate vulnerable neighborhoods, with low access to and reach to the benefits that might derive from whatever adaptation efforts are being done, including also being displaced by infrastructure that is labeled as climate adaptive or resilient. And due to their low political or social capital, they have limited opportunities to participate in decision-making processes around adaptation. So while race and ethnic background or migration status are increasingly considered as factors of vulnerability to climate health in analyses that are conducted by international or leading public health institutions elsewhere, such as in the US or Canada, or other places, an explicit consideration of migrants' climate health vulnerability in the European context is largely missing. We don't talk about race or ethnic background or migration status as a factor, as something to consider when we talk about the impacts of climate change and vulnerability to it. So what I argue here is that to look at how climate impacts migrants, how they understand and explain this type of exposure, of experience, and what knowledges do they carry around climate health adaptation, can provide novel insight on who forms part of the population of concern in climate urbanism, and how this relates to a social, environmental, and climate justice. So by shifting the attention to what immigrants do know, and not only in what they need, what they do know about climate health risk and how they respond to it in ways that can enhance their own adaptive capacities, but also more broadly that of urban regions, is to challenge monolithic and colonial narratives of immigrant groups as solely lacking responses or knowledge. Returning briefly to this question of the position of the observer that I mentioned at the beginning, in the chapter, in the broader work that is informed by this chapter, I draw from feminist epistemology and critique, especially here thinking with Donna Haraway's proposition on situated knowledge. As she writes, those who are not positioned well to influence epistemic resources will find that the dominant resources for knowing are less likely to be suited for knowing those parts of the world toward which their situatedness orients them. And this is where my proposition also lies, as I try to articulate in the chapter, where I basically say, well, let's look at adaptation. Let's look at adaptation from and with the already lived and experienced realities and struggles of people whose lives and livelihoods have already been at stake, even before climate hit them. Let's take adaptation ideas, especially to what concerns the local level, and bring it to mean something more radical. Adaptation as housing justice, adaptation as human and migration rights, adaptation in the hands of and through the knowledges of global majorities, adaptation as contested and conflictual necessarily, but also perhaps as a place for counter-politics. So this would mean looking at knowledge around climate, as well as vulnerability and adaptation, as something that reflects the perspectives of the knower and the context where this was created. But it would also address this issue of epistemic injustice. How do we get to understand, measure, and address climate vulnerability and adaptation? And it would include and necessitate a lens of vulnerability that pays attention to how knowledge is negotiated and changed, knowledge around bodily and embodied experiences of climate and health. How is it shaped by how people are subjectified to power, but also how engaging with that knowledge and putting such knowledge at the center can shift subjectivities of climate citizenship. I'll soon close. One other thing that I wanted to maybe highlight is that following, again, feminist thinking, the writings of Bell Hooks, Anna Ching, and many, many others, I propose that vulnerability and adaptation are not two separate things. And when we think of groups and communities like migrants, migrant residents from the global south in European cities, this idea of the margin, the social and spatial margins that migrants often occupy, that we don't think of it as static or unchangeable, not even as single-faceted. So looking at these margins that immigrants often find themselves in as places where exclusion and empowerment can converse, can coexist, well, where vulnerability is both inhabited and confronted. So I argue that immigrants are highly vulnerable, or can be, but they also hold valuable knowledge and experience that informs their adaptation responses and carries potential for more just adaptation. So I also had a few slides on some highlight empirical research that I did in Barcelona, but I don't have time to talk about that. Maybe we can do that if you're interested later. So I'll close here. Thanks for listening.
Thanks a lot, Panagiota. It was really interesting, and thanks also for guiding us through the chapter you wrote for the book, and also for bringing up questions that we certainly need to pay attention to. I would say now we have about 30 minutes, and the floor is free, and I would like to invite all our authors and audience members to share with us any reflection or comments or question that they want to bring up, solicited by these presentations we just heard, or by some ideas that have come up while we were discussing these themes. And is there anybody? Yes, somebody raised a hand. I can see it. Wait. So maybe I'm gonna say something, because I mean, these issues about the meaning of acting as activists or as political subjects more generally, and also the issue of the connection between vulnerability and adaptation are two themes that are very dear to me and that keep me very busy. So one thing I want to say about acting as both an academic studying grassroots environmentalism and social movements, but also as a political agent myself that traverse, participates, animate, and contribute to a social movement on the ground. So, and I found myself very often wondering about the actual meaning of blocking a road to denounce the government, stopping a minister's meeting, or acting out at a gala dinner of CEOs to see them cry or be unexpectedly being interrupted. So what's the meaning of that kind of, and I think for me, as a person thinking about these themes and acting about these themes, I think as activists in the climate change sphere, we are still looking for the right target and the right way, and also what exactly is our role as activists. Because I completely agree with Erik that there is a way in which activism for the climate, in the way we have seen it happening in recent years, it's completely within the borders or the perimeters that is actually imposed on us. So it's not choosing the battlefield. It's actually going into an arena in which we are already surveilled, disciplined, and what can be said or can be done has already been decided long time ago. So to break this deadlock, I think I've been thinking that the new role that this immense amount of energy liberated by youth and scientists and professionals deciding to join climate activism writ large, the new task, it's precisely to put aside the climate, like Erik said, and to work towards a common articulation of struggles. Being able to see that our role of activists for the climate in the West right now it's to connect already ongoing existing struggle. And so I think that the issue of convergence, it's actually what's going to keep us occupied from now on and in the next years as political agents, while we try to bring all those grievances and suffering that is traversing our societies and bring them into common platform for shared articulation towards projects that do not start from the climate, but start from what's wrong with the way society is organized. And this can only gain enough energy if we really explicitly work towards connection of struggles and common articulation. And the one very last thing, I think it is about the scaling up, but it's also about scaling down in a sense, because one problem that I've lived on my skin with the climate movements is that often the discourse can only be global, and so we can only hope into global institutions and country to do something, while instead the climate change grows out of every degraded zone, ecological destruction site, extractive sites, but also in the poor neighborhoods. That is where climate change is actually emerging from. And that is where it ultimately returns, also with the points raised by Panagiota about vulnerability being something that precedes climate change and precedes environmental issues, in the sense of being created by the very ordinary working of the current dominant socioeconomic structure. So I think that the climate activists should go out and connect with other movements existing and sometimes that have a long tradition of struggle and also a strategic and tactical a pool of knowledge from which we can draw from, and at the same time go local in the sense of understanding what are those social drivers of vulnerability at the local scale, what are those projects that are destroying environments just around the corner, and work there to stop those that is already contributing towards climate justice, in my view. So these were just a couple of reflections.
I think we had Aishem and Ashley asking for the floor.
Okay, I cannot see them. Why I cannot see them? Wait. Yes, okay. Yes. Yes, please, Ashley. Can you unmute yourself? Yes.
Yes, hi. I think Aishem had her hand raised first. Do you want to go, Aishem?
Yo, sorry.
No
I can see it. Ah, yes,
Hi,
please.
everyone.
Excuse
So
me,
lovely to
Aishem.
catch up with you, and so wonderful to read this book. I could only have a glance at it, and I'm so impressed with what has been accomplished. And thank you, Ashley, for letting me go first because I have to leave exactly at 7. My question is to all of us, actually, who is working in the countering points of urban studies, political studies, and climate adaptation. And as a big fan of Erik's work, and as someone who is committed to psychoanalytical understandings of politics, I want to just pose a question that maybe various people would in the next 5 minutes would respond. How do we understand our own commitments to processes that are making climate change continue, work in a way that is at once making it worse and at the same time allowing for possibilities of resistance to emerge? Because whenever I read Erik's work, I'm always super inspired by especially his understanding of Lacan and how we internalize the structures of continuity, how climate change continues because of us, but at the same time, we are resisting to it. And that conflict, that subconscious ways of responding to that conflict is something that preoccupies me. And it was so beautiful to be able to talk to all of you within this project and later with regards to this. How are we going to deal with the fact that we're struggling as individuals and as communities in this process? And do we know how to deal with Lacan and Lacanian concepts in this period as academics? So that's just something I put there, and whoever wants to touch it, please go ahead. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Aishem. I suggest maybe we take also Ashley's comment and then we will let Erik respond.
Okay, great. Great, thanks. It's lovely to be with you all. Congratulations, everyone, on the volume. And I know there was a huge amount of work that went into it. So I just have one kind of comment and a question that comes from it. You know, since we all began work on this volume, in other words, over the last couple of years, a massive debt crisis has enveloped the countries of the global South, you know, as central banks in Europe and North America have jacked up interest rates to bring down inflation. So global South countries have become immured in what is a debt crisis without historical precedent. And of course, that means massive cuts to social welfare and to the capacity to cope with the impacts of climate change, which of course are most heated in the global South. So my question is, you know, what can we as activists who are fighting for grassroots climate insurgency do to support movements around the world, but particularly in global South cities that are being impacted by this new round of savage debt? I'll stop there. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Ashley. Yeah, not an easy one. So yes, I leave the floor to Erik if he wants to address the comment of Aishem, or anybody else. Please raise your hand if you want to speak.
I'm happy to say a few things, but also more than happy to listen to comments of people in the audience. I mean, everything we're talking about are complex and important issues, and none of us have the solution or the answer to what to do. In the climate and more widely environment movement, what increasingly preoccupies me is trying to find an answer to what we want, and to what extent across social movements, including environmental movements, alliances can be nurtured around the question of desire. Desire understood as political desire. Most of our, that's true for many activists, but also for many academics, our desire is a negative one. That is, we don't like climate change, and we don't like the greenhouse gases that come with it. We don't like the injustices that are associated with it and that we can so well analyze. But we're not very good at articulating what it is we want in political terms or with a political name. Your climate change has no subject. In contrast to the working class struggle, the feminist struggle, the post-colonial struggle, one can see, think, and act around a politicizing subject. Feminist subjectivities, post-colonial subjectivities, proletarian subjectivities. The climate has no subject. It's a fetishistic displacement without a subject, and which accounts actually for the fact that it's so easy to have very strange alliances in that consensual configuration that is organized around climate change. Many extreme right-wing populist nationalist movements can be concerned with climate change too. So what we have, I think, systematically evaded is the question of political desire. What is it we want politically? And what are the politicizing signifiers around which a wide range of different movements can coalesce? Now, let me give a simple example of historically the working class movement. Yes, they were concerned with working conditions, salaries, etc. But ultimately that got articulated with a demand for socialism and or communism, and was damn successful in many ways of doing so. When I consider the wide range of environmental movements, I sense a desire that is expressed around discontent and disagreement, but very rarely one that is articulated around a prefigurative political name that captures the desire that seems to be implicitly there. I don't have an answer as to why that is, but I really do think also in order to nurture the kind of alliances that Salvatore was talking about earlier, is precisely where we can find the political alliances so that a range of different object causes get linked together: climate, income, security, democracy, etc. So that is a question that I have. There's very few politicizing signifiers that I find expressed explicitly, and an attempt to have a conversation about what is it we desire, politically speaking. And then finally, to repeat, I really think it's urgently needed to abandon the discourse of the master. That is the discourse around which most of climate change, the climate change argument is articulated. It's about greenhouse gases, it's about participation, it's about adaptation and resilience. I think it's vitally important to critically engage with that hegemonic narrative, so to speak, and how precisely the structure of that hegemonic master narrative permits to incorporate social movements such that nothing really changes. Is it possible to articulate the climate issue around a other set of narratives, etc., around questions of maladaptation, non-resilience, not participation, but democratization? And so, I mean, all these signifiers matter, and I think we're too much enthralled by what Lacan would call the university discourse, what science tells us. Now, science has always been the lackey of the existing order, so to speak, and we find ourselves in this kind of strange configuration in which we're both scientists / academics, but reject what most of the university discourse, what most academics do, because what they do is to nurture a techno-managerial, climate-obsessed, so to speak, types of policies. We should reject that. We should begin to see that our work as intellectuals is very, very different from the work that the climate specialists do. They are our enemies, I think. There are a number of other things I could say, but I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
Thanks a lot, Erik. If is there a reaction of Panagiota, if you want to talk, otherwise I have Ethemcan and also some questions in the chat.
Yes, I think maybe also addressing some of those questions that are from me in the chat. So I was a bit triggered by what you also said, Salvatore, about the fact that, you know, climate change sometimes is something very abstract that people in like big discourses deal with at the global level, you know, global CO2 emissions, global funding for adaptation or for loss and damage, etc. And that has its advantages and disadvantages, but the way I'm coming at it and the way it made more sense for me to understand it, because sometimes it's even hard for people like us to find an enter point that that has meaning, not only on paper, but also, you know, with the people that we interact with the people we do research with, do something that is not too abstract, at least for me. So this is why I'm coming at it from the embodied level, right? Climate is embodied from there, from the way it impacts on human bodies, I think is the thread that connects various scales and various issues. And it becomes easier to see that climate issues are labor issues, our housing issues, our urban planning issues, our social welfare issues, also issues of belonging, of exclusion, of racism, of citizenship. All these kind of come together and concentrate their impacts on human bodies. And I don't say it in an individualistic way, but rather in a way where scales kind of come and meet each other, from very, let's say, global processes to very intimate processes. So I see space for this kind of articulations of old and new concerns in movements, and maybe addressing some of one of the questions in the chat. Indeed, when I speak to immigrants in cities that I've done research in, climate is not their #1 concern. In fact, it doesn't even come up in most conversations that don't begin with a climate question, but rather begin with, how's your life? How do you get by? And so, however, and migrants, just like any other people, have different interpretations and understandings of climate change, but it does come to a point, especially in the last few years, I think, where the impacts have become, and maybe the discourse has become so hegemonic or so dominant that it is in people's minds in a lot more dominant fashion, right? People hear about climate change, and so they interpret what they experience using that language of climate change. And so I think that it's interesting to see, what possibilities that opens when climate adaptation or climate change in general, or climate vulnerability, becomes this space where other concerns can come to inform it, to explain it in a more critical way. One person asked me, could I hear a little bit about the findings? Maybe very briefly, I will say that what I found from the Raval in Barcelona, which is like 50% immigrant neighborhood, is that their number one concern in relation to heat and heat waves is housing, precarious housing conditions, people living in rental houses that have been broken down into very small apartments with no ventilation, with no possibility of installing an air conditioning or running it because energy costs, with no possibilities of accessing all this retrofit funding that EU has put out now for making houses more efficient and energy efficient, etc. Also labor precarity, like the fact that, what kind of jobs people can get also puts them automatically into higher risk and exposure, right? One cleaning lady told me that, I've asked for my time of work to be moved from the middle of the day to the evening so I can clean the house and not like have a heat stroke, but I have no contract. So if I have no contract, who can I complain to if I want to change something? So labor precarity is also a very strong, I think, driver of climate injustice. And I don't want to go into too much detail, but I think it's interesting to say that the spaces that people described as climate shelters, as heat shelters in the city, in the neighborhood of Raval, were also spaces of social mobilization and organizing. So an occupied center that a renters union was using, that a lot of initiatives, grassroots initiatives were born. This was the place that people said, this is where we can find relief, not only because it's cooler, not only because the temperature is lower, but because here we don't have to consume something in order to be with other people, because here we get together and we go through this together, no? We suffer through the hot nights. So it's also this element of sharing, no, the trouble of like, maybe like Erik said, of like sharing or feeding each other with courage to go along with things and to keep struggling for the things that they're struggling. I found that really interesting that the spaces that they mentioned were also spaces that began as social mobilization centers for housing, for LGBTQ rights, etc. So I leave it there.
Thanks a lot, Pana. Ethemcan.
I just wanted to comment on two things, that because both Panagiota and Erik and also Salvatore, you kind of really raised these issues in your interventions. But I really feel like what we are struggling against in this climate arena is really what is two ends of the same continuum. On the one hand, we have defeatism, basically. What is done, harm is done, and there's nothing to do anymore. And then you get basically approaches like deep adaptation, all that how to learn to die in the Anthropocene type of stuff. On the other hand, basically following the same continuum, you get the technofixes, carbon capture and storage, whatever, we direct air capture, we suck up everything and it will be all pretty in pink. I guess the challenge we have here is to how do we position adaptation as, for instance, Salvatore's work suggests, to think about it as social infrastructures of adaptation. The structures of care, social infrastructures of care in cities, of very similar to what Panagiota mentioned, those spaces and so on and so forth, instead of that defeatism on the adaptation end of the spectrum, and basically blow up, if not physical, at least political pipelines, in Andreas Malm's wording, on the mitigation side of things, okay? So how do we get to do this? I think that's really the $1 million euro, whatever question here. And for that, we still need to invest our political energies and really bringing those multidimensionality together in not really looking at, and maybe this is kind of also a contribution to think about, when we look at the social injustices, not start from climate change per se, but start from actually existing injustices, and climate crisis basically exacerbating it and making it even worse than they are, but not really ignoring what's out there in the real world. And I don't really have a question here. It's just that I feel like we are not only trying to fight against, you know, the climate crisis per se, but it's also the defeatism and also the whole techno fixes against this climate crisis.
Yes, thanks a lot, Ethemcan. I think you brought up some of the complexities, yeah, we are all struggling with. And Marco, please.
Thank you. I hope that you can hear me, right? Very quickly, because we should, I think, close very soon. I would like to pick up this issue about failure and success, because it's something that I'm also thinking a lot myself. What does it mean to succeed, and what does it mean to fail? No, because I mean, if on one side we can also say that it's really a neoliberal infrastructure of thinking, no? Because, you know, one could say, not me anyway, but one could say that socialism failed, isn't it, right? But on the other hand, it was also a big success, as Erik said. You know, we needed to, you know, the working class needed to think, to have an utopia, to get good hospitals and not working, you know, to the death in the mines in Europe. Now they are working in other places, right? So I think that maybe there is something to think about. What does it mean to succeed? What does it mean to fail? Would it be interesting to embrace failure, you know, and laugh about, you know, the neoliberal agenda always asking us to succeed? I am thinking here about one study done by a comrade and friend of mine, former student Sergio Ruiz Cayuela. No, he studied a small community close to Barcelona, Can San Juan. They were fighting against a huge incinerator, a cement factory, and you know, you can say they failed because the incinerator is still there, but you can also say that they succeed because they build a resistant community which is not anymore defined by that cement factory and incineration. So I don't know. I don't have an answer. I am really thinking with you about this, but I would also like to reclaim, you know, the fun of failure with class and with class in every way possible. The other thing I want to say very quickly is that I completely agree when Erik said that climate is not what is at stake. And I think that this is crucial. And I think that we have been working in this book about this, no, intersectionality. You know, there is a reification of the problem, always looking at the effects and on the cause. But here, and this is the last thing I want to say, I agree with that we lack a little bit of desire, you might say, of imagination or whatever it is, right? But isn't it that sometimes a no could also be powerful enough? I mean, in the end, the Zapatistas insurgency started with a no, no? John Holloway, the yeah, basta, enough is enough. I don't know. I am maybe a little more positive in this sense, saying that, you know, I can also live with a no in this moment, because sometimes I feel that we say too little no. I don't know if it's English here, because, you know, the neoliberal agenda is always also saying that no is unpolite in a way. You're not supposed to say no. You can say, well, let's negotiate. Well, maybe it's time to not negotiate anymore. It's time to subvert the logic of participation, because sometimes the best thing that you can do is to refuse to participate, which is still a no. And anyway, but again, it's no answer on my side, but so happy to be part of this conversation.
Thanks a lot, Marco. I'd say the biggest no is probably the one we should say to the climate solutions that are being actually implemented right now. So if as also Ashley said, that we need to build solidarity with the global south, probably right now the global south is as much at risk of the effects of climate change as much as with the solutions to climate change that the techno-managerial elite capitalist class is trying to come up with. And probably this also reminds us, you know, that at the same time that we need to build coalition and at the local level. At the same time, we need to be cognizant of what's happening on the other side of the world, and being able to connect the struggles in the core with the struggles in the periphery, and also finding ways to make the horizon not too far, to have victories, and at the same time going on with failure and failing better. And probably we will be in these dilemmas for many years to come. So on this, I don't know if hopeful or not note, I would like to thank everybody that was with us this evening, and really thank you so much for showing up, for your words, especially Panagiota and Erik, and thanks to my co-editors Marco and Ethemcan, amazing comrades, and to all our writers who contributed to the book. And really, I hope we're gonna meet each other on the front lines or on the classroom, but still doing the political work. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very, very much. And
Congratulations.
we'll meet
Thanks for being
again
here.
soon, undoubtedly. All the best. Have a great evening.
All the
Thanks.
best. Ciao.
Also.
Bye.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.